All right, Representative Bryant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Colbert, I had to step out a moment and missed your testimony, but I know that you have voiced some concerns about the fiscal note, and I wondered if you would elaborate on that and how it relates to our overall voucher proposal that's pending.
I'd be glad to. One of the things I found, I didn't get to see the fiscal note till about 7:30 this morning when it finally got posted, so I had notes that were originally scribbled on the basis of what was in Senate Bill 2, but I've done some calculations since then. One of the things that I found interesting is that the fiscal note said that the cost of the voucher, which was going to be 85% of the M&O funding, plus the amount of money that goes to the teacher retirement system, the average M&O funding plus the amount that goes to the teacher retirement system was going to be in the first year $10,330, and then it goes up to $10,498 and then $10,800 something. If you divide that $10,330 by 85%, by 0.85, what you find out is that they're basically saying is that that combined amount for M&O plus the amount of the teacher retirement system would come out to $12,153 in that first year. That would be that average cost of M&O, state and local, plus the retirement system. When I testified against it's the math. I mean, I can walk you through the math on that. When I testified against the various voucher bills that were in this committee last session, the amount of just the statewide average M&O that was listed by the Legislative Budget Board in all of the fiscal notes, including for Representative Harrison's bill that was at 100% of that statewide average cost, was $12,346. Okay, so somehow or another, a fiscal note for this year that says that we're going to include something else, the cost of teacher retirement system, is coming in at a level that is less than the amount 2 years ago for just the average state and local M&O cost. Now, why is that important? When I testified against that last session, 94% of the kids in public schools were in public schools that received less than $12,346 per student. The way they calculated that, as near as we could figure out, was if you took each district's average amount of M&O, state and local, and you added up all of those averages, and then you took the average of the average, that might get you to that level. And that's the way that they actually do figuring for the amount of small and mid-sized funding that charter schools get. The problem with that is the vast majority of the school districts in Texas receive either small or mid-sized funding. And so when you do that average of the averages, you skew it to the much, much higher funding that those districts receive. And most of the kids don't get the benefit of that. But you would be giving that benefit to all of the kids who were in the voucher program. Now, this year, you come up with a different number, a lower number, even though you've got an extra factor put into it. So at the very least, that points out that if you don't statutorily define how that state average is calculated within the bill, you don't know what that cost is going to be. It could be the $12,346 from last time around, plus the several $100 increase that they've gotten in state and local money since then, about $460 they've gotten in state and local revenue since then, plus the amount of TRS. And then the fiscal note on this bill would be way off because it would cost you several $1 billion more. So that's one of the things that you need to clarify. The other thing is that in calculating that state average of M&O for state and local, it includes the money that districts are already spending on special education. And districts spend a lot of money on special education from a combination of both state and local resources, as we've heard in repeated testimony before this committee. So you're going to give all of the charter, all of the private schools the impact in this voucher of the statewide average of special education funding, even though, number one, you don't require them to provide any special education services. And then number two, if they do provide them, then you're going to give them extra funding in two different ways. You will, first of all, give them a higher voucher, a percentage higher voucher, and then depending on if they're in the special needs category, you could give them additional costs up to $30,000. So by the way in which this fiscal note explains the bill, you are double counting and paying the private schools twice for the cost of special education services if they provide them, or you are paying them for special education services even if they don't accept any special education students. There are some other problems, but those are some of the ones that I find that are particularly problematic.
Thank you.
So the amounts that LBB has provided in the fiscal note is not correct?
We don't know how they calculated it, and that's what I'm saying. You need to be specific in the manner in which that calculation is done, because they obviously used a different methodology this year than they used 2 years ago.
Yeah, so-
And we don't know which of the two methodologies will then be utilized by the comptroller's office if this bill were to become law, because you now have two totally different ways of coming up with numbers, clearly because you got a lower number this year for what should be a much more expensive cost.
Okay, so you dispute the way they calculated it? At 85,
I don't know the way they calculated it because it's not
85%
spelled out in the bill.
85% of total state and local maintenance operations funding under the FSP plus state retirement contributions to TRS per student in ADA would be $10,330 in fiscal year 2027, $10,498 in fiscal year 2028, increasing to $10,899 fiscal year
Yes.
2030.
That's what they say in this one, but 2 years ago, they obviously used a different methodology of calculating just the M&O amount without including the retirement system in it. So which is it? And unless you spell it out in the bill, it will be up to them to decide later on. Suppose they decide later on that it will be last session's methodology.
So the entire analysis of the program could be flawed in terms of the fiscal note if these numbers are flawed. So if we talk about the cost of the budget and, you know, this biennium, that biennium, that could not be accurate as well.
I think that
per your math.
Per my math, which, you know, I'd be glad to hear an alternative to what I've just said in terms of what was in the bills last time and what's in it this time around. But according to that, it would seem that either last session they were overstating what that average cost was going to be, or this time they're understating it. And either of those could be true because there's two different methodologies of how you calculate that out, and the bill doesn't specify which methodology would be used. So that would be decided after the legislature goes home.
Yeah, so we can just assume that the calculations in the fiscal note are incorrect, and that we cannot, you know, we don't really have accurate information in front of us. Is that what you're saying?
No, my testimony again is that you don't know what methodology they used. They've used obviously two different methodologies in two different sessions. So unless you specify
the bill from 2023 is not before this committee. So we were talking about this bill. And it's either, you know, you say it's math, and I'm just calling it reading, because I'm reading it here off the fiscal note.
And Mr. Chairman, respectfully, when I served as budget chair of this committee, I would have requested them to specify the method by which they did the calculations so we would know what the legislative intent of how this process was going to work is, because there are two different ways of figuring averages according to the Texas Education Agency, and they use one in some circumstances and the other way of doing it in the other, and you're leaving it up to them to decide that after the fact rather than specifying it in the bill.
And so, okay, so you're picking your method of calculations on your chart, and then now you're saying they're not picking the right calculations. We can go round and round on all this. I appreciate your work. Obviously, I just disagree with what you have to say today. Members, any other questions? Representative Schoolcraft.
Mr. Colbert, are you a member of the Legislative Budget Board?
No, I'm not a member of the Legislative Budget Board.
Were you there when they were doing their deliberations, coming up with the recommendations for this year?
Nope.
All right. You very emphatically state that the funding for the school choice program is coming out of public education funding. How do you know that it didn't come from what would have gone to higher ed funding, or maybe highway funding?
I don't.
Maybe Parks and Light. You don't, do you?
No. And
So how can you say that the money comes from public education?
because in the 50 years I have been doing this, Representative Schoolcraft, in the 50 years that I have been doing this, I have never seen a session where the leadership doesn't get together before the session and agree on a general amount of money that they appropriate for education, all of education, a general amount of money that they appropriate for health care, a general amount of money that they appropriate for corrections, et cetera. And then you get to move those numbers around within those areas, but it takes a supermajority vote in the Appropriations Committee, or at least it used to be able to go beyond that amount within any one of those areas. And then when it comes to the floor, you have a rule that says that in order to put more money into one program, you have to take it from somewhere else.
But in all those 50 years, has there ever been a separate public education program and a separate school choice program?
No, there
I mean,
hasn't.
every time it's been, they decide how much goes into public education. This is a brand-new program. You don't know how they treated it. You weren't in the room, were you?
Mr. Schoolcraft, if you take the $7 billion cost for next biennium that the budget board, with what I think is an unrealistically low percentage of the kids who are already in private education who would take advantage of it, but if you take that $7 billion cost and you add it to the money that this legislature spent last biennium on tax relief, which at one point was $18.7 billion, but is now apparently $22.7 billion. And then you add that to the money that's going to be there for tax relief in this session.
We're not talking about tax relief, Mr. Colbert.
Mr.
And we're going to be
Schoolcraft,
here
I'm trying
till 4 in
to
the
answer-
morning if we want to go off on those rabbit
I'm trying
trails.
to answer your question, Mr. Schoolcraft, if you will let me. If you add those numbers together, and you compare them to the resources that the legislature had prior to last session available to it, I think it is unreasonable to assume that you will, once we blow through these surpluses we've had the last couple sessions, that we will have the type of money to be able to spend on any of those programs, on special education, on public education, on higher education, on highways are constitutionally dedicated, so that they're sort of safe from it, but on health care, on corrections, on anything else that doesn't have a constitutional protection, I think that you're going to be in a serious difficulty. And as the person who had to serve as the budget chair when we went through the fiscal crisis in 1986 and 1987 after the oil crash, believe me, you don't want to be in the position, you don't want to be in the hole you're about to dig yourself into.
Well, I really appreciate that. Sounds like a lot of assumptions. I didn't follow totally the circuitous reasoning, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Chairman Frank.
Just a very quick question, because we have a ton of other people.
Sure.
Are you here on your own, or are you
I'm here on my
consulting
own.
for somebody else? Are you getting paid by anybody?
I'm not getting paid to be here to testify on this, no.
Okay, that's close to not getting paid here to testify. Or you do consulting work in this area for
I do
anyone?
consulting work in this area, but
what
I am
types
not,
of-
I
what
have not
types of
been asked or
organizations?
authorized by any people I consult with
What
to
types of
testify.
organizations do you do consulting work for?
I do consulting work for, I do consulting work for the Equity Center, which is an association of about 600 and something of the school districts in the state. I do consulting work for individual school districts. I do consulting work for individual community colleges. I
Okay,
am
so
not
it's-
here
I
on
mean,
behalf.
it's pretty important to say, though, because that is who is paying you. It may not pay for your consulting. I just wanted, so thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Representative Frank, I'm here on my own because I
Okay.
care about
Thank you very
this
much.
stuff.
Representative Kerwin?